She begged him not to stop, and he thought she meant something else entirely. By the time Tahir Firehand understood what Henrietta Sutton was really asking for, 3 men lay dead in the canyon, and the woman who should have died that night was still breathing. Some misunderstandings cost lives. This one saved one. The taste of copper filled her mouth before the pain arrived. Dust and blood mixed on her tongue, gritty and warm, choking her with every shallow breath she tried to take. Henrietta Sutton had been running for 2 days straight through the Sierra Nevada foothills, her legs screaming with exhaustion, her vision blurring at the edges like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The hem of her dress, once a respectable dove grey, now hung in tatters, shredded by brambles and rocks, soaked through with creek water and her own sweat. Her hands were raw, palms torn open from catching herself during countless falls, fingernails broken and bleeding from clawing her way up steep ravines when her legs finally gave out beneath her. She had stopped screaming his name 3 nights ago. Screaming only brought them closer, and they were already close enough. She could hear them sometimes, in the quiet moments between her own ragged breathing, their voices carried on the wind like wolves howling after wounded prey. They never shouted. They never had to. Men like Samuel Pritchard and his brothers did not need to raise their voices to be terrifying. Their certainty was enough. Their patience was worse. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the California wilderness, turning the air thick and heavy, making each breath feel like swallowing fire. Hetty stumbled over a root she did not see, went down hard on her knees, felt something crack inside her chest that made the world tilt sideways. She tried to stand, failed, tried again. Her body simply would not obey anymore. It had carried her as far as it could, and now it was done. She collapsed forward onto her hands, her hair falling around her face in matted, dirty tangles, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and terror, and something deeper, something that felt like her soul trying to escape through her skin. That was when she heard the footsteps, not behind her, ahead, coming toward her through the pines with a rhythm that spoke of someone who knew these mountains, someone who moved through them like water flowing downhill, natural and unhurried. Hetty's head snapped up, panic flooding her veins with fresh energy she did not know she still had. She tried to crawl backward, her broken hands slipping in the dirt, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Another man, another hunter. She could not do this again. But when he stepped into the small clearing where she had fallen, he was not what she expected. Tahir Firehand stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame lean and strong, in the way of men who lived off the land rather than off other people. His skin was the deep bronze of someone who had never known the inside of a city. His long black hair pulled back and tied with a strip of leather, a few loose strands framing a face that was all sharp angles and watchful eyes. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt that had seen better days, both earth-toned and practical, and across his back he carried a rifle that looked like it had been well used but well cared for. His feet made almost no sound as he moved, and his dark eyes took in everything about her in a single sweeping glance that felt like being read like a book. Tahir had been tracking an elk for the better part of the morning when he found her trail instead. He almost ignored it. White settlers often wandered into Cahto territory, got themselves lost, got themselves found again. It was not his concern. His people had enough troubles without adding the problems of outsiders to the pile. But something about the tracks had bothered him. The gait was wrong, irregular, the stride too short and frantic. Someone running, someone terrified. And then he had seen the blood. Not much, just a few drops on a rock, then a smear on a tree trunk where someone had caught themselves from falling, then more. Always moving east, always desperate. Now he stood looking down at the source of that trail, and his jaw tightened. The woman on the ground was in bad shape. Her dress was destroyed, her hands bleeding, her face so bruised and swollen, he could barely make out what she must have looked like before whatever had happened to her. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. He had seen a lot of things in his 32 years walking these mountains. He had seen animals caught in traps, their eyes wild with pain and terror. He had seen men dying, their gazes growing distant as life slipped away. But he had never seen eyes quite like hers. They were the grey-green of storm clouds, and they held the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what was hunting you. Hetty tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, too raw from days of running and not enough water. What came out was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. She swallowed hard, tasted blood again, tried once more. Her voice cracked on the words, but she got them out, each one costing her more effort than the last. The sun was directly overhead now, pouring heat down on both of them like a physical weight. And somewhere in the distance, a raven called out, harsh and lonely. "Please," she managed, her whole body trembling. "Don't stop. Keep going. Just keep going past me." Tahir's brow furrowed. He took a step closer, and she flinched so violently that she nearly toppled over sideways. He froze. His hand, which had been moving toward his water skin, went still. For a long moment neither of them moved. A hot wind pushed through the pines, making them sway and whisper. Dust devils spun in the clearing. Somewhere far off a hawk screamed. The woman was still staring at him with those storm cloud eyes, and he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that she was not asking him to leave her alone because she did not want help. She was asking him to leave her alone because she thought he was going to hurt her. "I am not going to harm you," he said quietly, his voice low and careful, the way you might speak to a spooked horse. His English was perfect, though his accent carried the musical lilt of his mother tongue underneath it. He had learned the language from missionaries as a boy, back before his tribe had moved deeper into the mountains to escape the settlers flooding into California. Back before he had learned that speaking their language did not make them see you as human. Hetty shook her head weakly, her breath coming faster now, panic rising in her chest like floodwater. "You don't understand. They're coming. If you stay, they'll kill you too. Please just go. Forget you saw me." Tahir's eyes narrowed slightly. They, not he, not it. They. His gaze swept the tree line behind her, searching for movement, for signs of pursuit. He saw nothing yet, but that did not mean nothing was there. His hand moved to the rifle on his back, not drawing it, but making sure it was ready if needed. When he looked back at the woman, his expression had shifted. The caution was still there, but now there was something else beneath it. A kind of understanding. A recognition. "How many?" he asked simply. She blinked at him, confused for a moment, her exhausted mind struggling to keep up. "What? How many are hunting you?" The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that for a moment Hetty forgot to be terrified. She stared at him, this strange man who had appeared out of nowhere, who had not tried to touch her, who was asking practical questions instead of demanding explanations. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before, like a child admitting to something shameful. 3, maybe 4. "I'm not sure if the youngest brother is still with them or if he turned back." Tahir nodded once, a short, sharp movement. He unslung his rifle and checked it with practiced efficiency, his hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of use. Then he looked at her again, and this time there was something almost gentle in his expression, though his voice remained steady and calm. "Can you walk?" Hetty tried to push herself up, got halfway to her feet before her legs buckled, and she went down hard on her knees again. Pain shot through her chest where something had cracked earlier, and she bit back a cry. Tears of frustration and shame burned in her eyes. She could not even stand. How was she supposed to run? "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry? I can't." Tahir was already moving. He crouched down beside her, still not touching her, but close enough now that she could smell the wood smoke and sage on his clothes, could see the small scars that marked his hands and forearms. His eyes met hers, and when he spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "You're going to have to trust me." Hetty let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Trust. That word felt like a foreign language now. Something she had once known how to speak, but had forgotten completely. She had trusted her father when he told her Samuel Pritchard was a good man, a man of standing in the community, a man who would provide for her. She had trusted Samuel when he promised her a better life in California, away from the crowded streets of Boston, away from her family's debts. She had trusted him right up until the night he locked her in the cellar of his ranch house and told her she would learn her place one way or another. "I don't know how," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tahir studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he did something unexpected. He reached up and removed the leather cord from his hair, letting it fall loose around his shoulders. He held the cord out to her, a simple gesture, but she understood what he was offering. A choice, control, something she had not had in a very long time. "Then hold this," he said quietly. "If I do anything you do not like, you pull on it. Hard as you can. It will hurt. I will stop. Do you understand?" Hetty stared at the leather cord, then at him, then back at the cord. It was such a small thing, such a strange thing, but it was something. Some tiny measure of power returned to her, some acknowledgement that her fear was real and reasonable and deserved to be respected. Slowly, carefully, she reached out with one shaking, bloody hand and took the cord from him. She wrapped it once around her palm, holding it tight. "Good," Tahir said with a small nod. "Now I'm going to pick you up. We need to move. They are close." Before she could respond, he moved with startling speed and efficiency. One arm went under her knees, the other around her back, and then she was lifted off the ground as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped, her body going rigid with instinctive panic, her hand tightening on the leather cord. But he did not tighten his grip in response. He did not press her closer. He simply held her securely and started walking, his stride long and steady, carrying her through the forest with the kind of sure-footedness that spoke of someone who had walked these paths 1,000 times before. Hetty's heart hammered in her chest, but slowly, gradually, she realized he was doing exactly what he said he would do. Nothing more, nothing less. He was not hurting her. His hands were firm but not cruel. His arms were strong but not imprisoning. And most importantly, he was moving away from the direction she had come from. Away from the men who were hunting her, deeper into the wilderness where Samuel Pritchard and his brothers would have a much harder time following. They had been moving for perhaps 10 minutes when Tahir suddenly stopped. Hetty felt his whole body go tense, his head tilting slightly to one side like a wolf scenting the air. Then she heard it too, voices, faint but growing louder, coming from the west. Coming fast. How far behind were they? Tahir asked, his voice barely a murmur. "I don't know," Hetty breathed, her own voice shaking. "An hour, maybe. Maybe less. They have horses." Tahir's jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the surrounding terrain with the focused intensity of a predator, assessing a hunting ground. Then he moved again, faster now, carrying her off the main trail and into a dense thicket of manzanita and scrub oak. The branches tore at them both as he pushed through, and Hetty buried her face against his shoulder instinctively, trying to make herself as small as possible. They came out on the other side in a narrow ravine, steep and rocky, with a small stream running through the bottom. Tahir set her down carefully behind a large boulder, his movements quick but controlled. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not move. Do not make a sound." Hetty grabbed his arm without thinking, her fingers digging into his skin with desperate strength. "What are you doing?" "You can't fight them. There are too many." Tahir looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Something flickered in his expression, something she could not quite read. Then he reached up and gently removed her hand, but he did not let go of it right away. He held it for just a moment, his thumb brushing across her torn knuckles with unexpected gentleness. "I am not going to fight them," he said quietly. "I am going to make sure they do not find you. There is a difference." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving back through the ravine with that same silent, fluid grace, disappearing into the brush like smoke dissipating in wind. Hetty pressed herself against the boulder, her whole body shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She still had his leather cord wrapped around her palm, and she clutched it now like a lifeline, the only solid thing in a world that had gone completely mad. The voices were closer now. She could make out words. Samuel's voice, rough and angry, barking orders. His brother Marcus, responding with something she could not quite catch. The sound of horses moving through underbrush, their hooves clattering on rocks. They were so close, so terribly, impossibly close. Hetty closed her eyes and pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to silence even her breathing, trying to become invisible, trying to simply cease existing. Then Tahir's voice rang out through the forest, clear and strong and utterly fearless. He was speaking in his own language, the words rising and falling with a musical cadence that was both beautiful and utterly foreign to her ears. Then he switched to English, his tone sharp and commanding. "You are on Cahto land. Turn back." There was a moment of shocked silence. Then Samuel's voice, arrogant and dismissive. "We're looking for a woman. She's our property. She ran from my ranch. If you've seen her, you'd best hand her over." "I have seen no woman," Tahir replied, his voice calm but edged with something cold. "And even if I had, no person is property. Not here?" "Listen, Indian," Marcus cut in, his voice dripping with contempt. "We don't want trouble with you savages. Just tell us which way she went and we'll be gone." What happened next happened fast. Too fast for Hetty to fully process. She heard Tahir say something else in his own language, low and rhythmic. Then she heard horses neighing in sudden panic, the sound of men cursing and shouting. A gunshot cracked through the air, impossibly loud, echoing off the canyon walls. Then another. Then silence. Hetty's heart stopped. She waited, frozen in place, every muscle locked tight, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Tahir was dead. They had killed him. They were coming for her now. She would be dragged back to that cellar, back to that darkness, back to footsteps, coming toward her hiding place, slow, steady. She pressed herself harder against the rock, her breath catching in her throat, her vision going dark at the edges. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the boulder. A shadow fell across the ground, where she could see it. A long moment of silence, then Tahir's voice, quiet and careful. "They are gone. You can come out now." Hetty did not move at first. Could not move. Her body had locked up completely, paralyzed by terror and exhaustion and the overwhelming impossibility of what was happening. Then slowly, inch by painful inch, she forced herself to look around the edge of the boulder. Tahir stood there, his rifle still in his hands but lowered now, pointed at the ground. There was no blood on him, no signs of injury. His face was calm, though his eyes were hard, watchful. "Did you kill them?" she asked, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. Tahir shook his head once. "No, I fired into the air, stampeded their horses in 3 different directions. It will take them hours to round them up again, and by then we will be long gone. They will not find this place." Hetty stared at him, trying to understand. He had not killed them. He had not even hurt them. He had simply scattered them like leaves in the wind and sent them running. A sound escaped her throat, something between a laugh and a sob, and suddenly she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the fear, all the pain, all the exhaustion she had been holding back for days came pouring out of her in a flood she could not control. She doubled over, her arms wrapped around her middle, and wept. Tahir stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then slowly, carefully, he crouched down a few feet away from her. He did not try to touch her, did not try to stop her crying. He simply sat there in silence, waiting, giving her the space to fall apart without judgment, without demands. And somehow that quiet presence, that simple act of bearing witness to her breaking without trying to fix it or take advantage of it, was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could remember. When her sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, Tahir reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small strip of dried meat and a leather water skin. He held them out to her without a word. Hetty looked at the offerings, then at him, then back at the food and water. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took them. The water was cool and clean, tasting of mountain springs, and it hurt to swallow, but she drank anyway, desperate for it. The meat was tough and salty, and she had never tasted anything better in her life. "Thank you," she whispered when she finally found her voice again. The words felt inadequate, impossibly small for what he had just done, but they were all she had. Tahir nodded once. "We should keep moving. They will regroup eventually. I know a place where you will be safe for now." Hetty looked down at the leather cord, still wrapped around her palm. Then she looked up at him. This stranger who had saved her life without asking for anything in return, who had given her back a measure of control when she thought she would never have any again. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something besides fear. It was small, fragile, but it was there, hope. The journey deeper into Cahto territory took the rest of the afternoon, and Hetty lost track of time somewhere between the second creek crossing and the moment the sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks. Tahir carried her for the first hour, his movements tireless and efficient, navigating terrain that would have been treacherous even for someone on horseback. The forest changed around them as they climbed higher into the mountains, the scrub oak and manzanita giving way to towering ponderosa pines and ancient redwoods that blocked out the sky. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and damp earth. Birds called to each other in languages Hetty did not recognize, and once she saw a deer watching them from between the trees, its dark eyes calm and unafraid before it melted back into the shadows. When Tahir finally set her down again, it was beside a fallen log, near a small spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. Her legs were still weak, still trembling, but the rest and the water had helped. She could stand now, though walking any distance seemed impossible. Tahir knelt by the spring and filled his water skin, then offered it to her again. She drank deeply this time, not just sipping but gulping it down, like a woman who had spent days in a desert, which in a way she had. A desert of fear and pain that had nothing to do with sand or heat and everything to do with the absence of safety. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. She was looking at him differently now, studying his face in the fading light. He had a scar that ran along his jaw, barely visible unless you were close enough to see it. Another on his left hand, between thumb and forefinger. Marks of a life lived outside the confines of civilization, outside the rules that govern places like Boston or Sacramento. A life that suddenly seemed infinitely more honest than anything she had known. "Not far," Tahir replied, his eyes scanning the darkening forest around them. "Another hour, maybe less. But we need to keep moving. The light is going fast, and there are things in these mountains that hunt at night. Things more dangerous than the men who were following you." Hetty felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "What kind of things?" Tahir stood slinging the water skin over his shoulder. "Mountain lions, bears, sometimes men who have forgotten they were men. The wilderness does not care about your reasons for being here. It only cares whether you respect it or not." He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, but Hetty heard the truth in his words. This was not her world. She was a visitor here, ignorant and vulnerable, and survival depended entirely on the man standing beside her. A man she had known for less than a day. A man whose language she barely understood and whose customs were completely foreign to her. And yet somehow, impossibly, she felt safer with him than she had felt in 3 years with the man she'd been forced to call husband. They walked in silence for a while, Tahir adjusting his pace to match her halting, painful steps. Every so often he would pause and listen, his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowed as he read signs in the forest that were invisible to her. Once he held up a hand, stopping her mid-step, and they stood frozen for several long minutes while something large moved through the underbrush 50 yards to their left. Hetty never saw what it was, but she heard it, a heavy, deliberate rustling that made her heart pound and her breath catch in her throat. Tahir's hand rested lightly on his rifle, but he did not draw it. Eventually the sound faded, moving away from them, and they continued on. The sun was nearly gone when they finally reached their destination. At first Hetty did not see it. The camp was so well hidden, so perfectly integrated into the landscape, that her eyes simply passed over it like it was part of the forest itself. Then Tahir stepped forward and pushed aside a curtain of hanging moss, and suddenly she was looking at a small shelter built into the side of a massive redwood tree. It was not a house, not in any sense she would have recognized. It was more like a cave that had been improved upon, its entrance covered with animal skins that had been sewn together and its floor lined with what looked like woven reed mats. A fire pit had been dug just outside, ringed with smooth river stones, and beside it sat a collection of tools and supplies that spoke of someone who lived here regularly, not just occasionally. "This is your home?" Hetty asked, surprise evident in her voice. She had expected something different, something more primitive perhaps, or more elaborate. This was neither. It was simply practical, efficient, designed for survival rather than comfort, but not without a certain rough beauty. Tahir shook his head. "One of them. I have several camps throughout these mountains. I move between them depending on the season and where the hunting is good. This one is the most remote. No one comes here except me." He ducked inside the shelter and emerged a moment later with a bundle of kindling and dried wood. Within minutes he had a fire going, the flames casting dancing shadows across the clearing and pushing back the darkness that was rapidly enveloping the forest. The temperature was dropping fast now that the sun had set, and Hetty found herself gravitating toward the fire's warmth without conscious thought. She sank down onto one of the mats, her whole body sagging with exhaustion so profound it felt like her bones were melting. Tahir disappeared into the shelter again and returned with several items. A wool blanket that looked like it might have come from a trading post, a small pot for boiling water, and a leather pouch that clinked when he set it down. He hung the pot over the fire on an ingenious tripod made from green branches, filled it with water from a nearby barrel, and then opened the pouch to reveal a collection of dried herbs and roots. He selected several, crushed them between his fingers, and dropped them into the heating water. Almost immediately a sharp medicinal smell rose from the pot, something between mint and sage, but not quite either. "What is that?" Hetty asked, watching him work with steady, practiced movements. "Medicine," Tahir replied simply, "for pain and fever. You have been running for days. Your body needs help healing or you will get sick, maybe die." The bluntness of his words should have been frightening, but somehow they were not. They were just honest, delivered without judgment or emotion. He was not trying to scare her. He was simply stating a fact. Hetty looked down at her hands, at the torn skin and dried blood, at the bruises that were starting to purple along her wrists and forearms. She had been so focused on escaping, on surviving the next hour and then the next, that she had not thought about what came after. About what it would take to actually heal, about whether healing was even possible. The water began to boil, and Tahir poured some of it into a tin cup, let it cool for a moment, then handed it to her. "Drink it all. It will taste bitter, but it will help." Hetty took the cup and sipped cautiously. Bitter was an understatement. The liquid tasted like earth and bark, and something else she could not identify, something wild and ancient. She grimaced but kept drinking, forcing it down in small swallows until the cup was empty. Tahir nodded in approval and refilled it, this time adding something different from his pouch, something that turned the water a pale golden color and made it smell like honey. "This one is better," he said with the ghost of a smile. "For sleep." Hetty accepted the second cup gratefully and drank. This one was indeed better, sweet and soothing, and she felt its warmth spreading through her chest and down into her limbs. Her eyelids grew heavy almost immediately, and she had to fight to keep them open. Tahir was moving around the camp now, checking the perimeter, making sure everything was secure for the night. She watched him through increasingly blurred vision, watched the way he moved like water, like wind, like something that belonged here in a way she never would. "Why are you helping me?" The question came out before she could stop it, slurred slightly from exhaustion and whatever herbs he had given her. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Tahir stopped what he was doing and turned to look at her. The firelight caught his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the deep shadows under his eyes. For a long moment he did not answer, and Hetty thought perhaps he would not. Then he came and sat down across the fire from her, his movements deliberate and slow, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost sad. "I had a sister once," he said, staring into the flames. "Her name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom. She was younger than me by 3 years, and she had a laugh that sounded like birds singing. When she was 16, a group of white men came to our village. They said they were traders. They wanted to buy furs and baskets, and my father welcomed them because he believed in trying to live in peace with the settlers. That night they took Ayana, just took her while we slept. By the time we realized she was gone, they were already a day's ride away." His jaw tightened, and Hetty saw his hands curl into fists where they rested on his knees. She did not speak, did not interrupt. She just listened, the way he had listened to her earlier, giving him space to carry his pain into words. "We tracked them for 2 weeks. My father, my uncle, and me. We followed them all the way to a mining camp near the American River. When we found her, she was already broken. They had used her and then sold her to someone else, and that person had used her and sold her again. We brought her home, but she was not Ayana anymore." She did not laugh. She did not speak. She would just sit and stare at nothing for hours. "My mother tried everything, prayers, medicine, love. Nothing worked. 6 months later, Ayana walked into the forest and did not come back. We found her 3 days later by the river. She had filled her pockets with stones and walked into the water." Hetty felt tears streaming down her face, hot and silent. She had not realized she was crying until Tahir looked up and saw them. His expression softened slightly, though the pain in his eyes remained. "So when I saw you today," he continued, "running through the forest with that look in your eyes, the same look Ayana had, I knew I could not walk away. Not again. I could not save my sister, but maybe I could save you. Maybe that would mean something. Maybe it would not, but I had to try." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of shared understanding, of wounds recognized if not healed. Hetty wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt across her cheeks. When she finally found her voice, it was small but steady. "I'm sorry about your sister. I'm sorry that happened to her." "To your family?" Tahir nodded once, accepting her words. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to. But sometimes speaking the poison out loud makes it lose some of its power." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hetty looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The herbs were making her feel distant from herself, like she was floating slightly above her own body, and maybe that distance made it easier to speak. Maybe it made it possible to say things she had never said out loud to anyone. "My father owed money," she began, her voice flat and emotionless, like she was reciting someone else's story. "A lot of money. To men who do not forgive debts. Samuel Pritchard offered to pay it off in exchange for marrying me. My father said yes without asking me. He said it was a good match, that Samuel was wealthy and respectable, that I would have a better life in California than I could ever have in Boston. So I went, I married him, and for the first 3 months everything seemed fine. He was polite. Distant but polite. Then one night he came home drunk, and I said something he did not like. I do not even remember what it was. Something small, trivial. He hit me. Not hard, just once. And then he apologized. Said it would never happen again. She paused, swallowing hard. The memories were rising now, sharp and clear despite the herbs, despite the distance. Maybe because of them. Maybe they needed to come out. But it did happen again. And again. Each time worse than the last. Each time with a new excuse. I had not cooked dinner right. I had spoken to another man in town. I had smiled wrong. I had breathed wrong. After about 6 months, he stopped making excuses. He just hit me when he felt like it, and then he started doing worse things. Things I cannot talk about. Things that make me feel dirty even thinking about them. When I tried to leave the first time, he caught me at the edge of the property. He dragged me back to the house and locked me in the cellar. He said I would stay there until I learned to be grateful for what I had. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. Tahir had shared his pain with her. The least she could do was share hers. I was in that cellar for 3 years. 3 years! He would come down sometimes with food, sometimes with a lamp, sometimes with nothing but his fists and his rage. He said I was his property, that I had no right to leave, that no one would believe me if I tried to tell them what he was doing, because he was Samuel Pritchard, respected rancher and upstanding citizen, and I was just a woman who had gone mad. And the terrible thing is, he was probably right. No one would have believed me. No one would have cared. She looked up at Tahir, her eyes burning with unshed tears, and something fiercer, something that looked almost like rage. Do you know what it does to a person? Being locked in darkness for that long? I started to forget what the sky looked like. I forgot seasons. I forgot music. I forgot my own face because there were no mirrors down there, nothing reflective except sometimes water in a bucket, and even then I could barely see myself. I became nothing, a ghost, something that existed only when he decided I should exist. Tahir's expression had gone very still, very quiet. His hands had unclenched and now rested palm down on his knees, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was locked tight. He was angry. Not at her, for her. The distinction mattered more than she could have explained. 3 nights ago he came down drunk, Hetty continued, her voice growing stronger now, fueled by something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. He said he was tired of keeping me, said I had cost him too much time and trouble, said he was going to take me out into the desert and leave me there to die, because at least then he would be rid of me, and no one would ever know what happened. He unlocked the chains, started dragging me up the stairs, and something inside me just snapped. I do not know what it was. Maybe I finally understood that I was going to die either way, so I might as well try. When we got to the top of the stairs, I grabbed a lamp off the wall and smashed it over his head. She stopped, her breath coming faster now, her hands shaking despite the calming herbs Tahir had given her. This was the part she had not let herself think about, the part that made her a murderer. The part that meant she could never go back. He fell down the stairs, she whispered. I heard his neck break. I heard it. And then I ran. I just ran. I did not take anything. I did not plan anything. I just opened the door and ran into the night, and I did not stop. His brothers must have found him the next morning, because by afternoon I could hear them coming after me. They have been chasing me ever since. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, long and mournful. Hetty pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, suddenly cold despite the flames. She had said it all now, every terrible truth, every shameful secret. And now Tahir knew exactly what kind of person she was. A killer, a murderer, someone who deserved to be hunted. But when she finally worked up the courage to look at him, she did not see judgment in his eyes. She saw something else entirely, understanding, and beneath that, a fierce kind of protectiveness that made her throat tighten. You are not a murderer, Tahir said quietly but firmly. You are a survivor. There is a difference, is there? Hetty asked, her voice breaking. I killed a man. I took a life. How is that not murder? Because murder requires choice, Tahir replied. It requires planning, intention, malice. What you did was instinct. An animal caught in a trap will gnaw off its own leg to escape. That is not suicide. That is survival. You did what you had to do to stay alive. There is no shame in that, no guilt. Only life. His words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Hetty wanted to believe them. Wanted to let them sink into her bones and wash away the stain. She felt it marked her soul. But 3 years of being told she was worthless, 3 years of being treated like property, 3 years of having every bit of self-worth systematically destroyed. Those things did not disappear just because someone said kind words. Healing would take longer than a single conversation around a fire. She knew that. But maybe this was a start. Maybe believing she deserved to heal was the first step. I do not know how to be anything except afraid anymore. she admitted quietly. "I do not remember how to be a person, how to want things, how to make choices. He took all of that away from me, and I do not know how to get it back." Tahir was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he stood and walked over to his supply area. He rummaged through a pack and returned with something in his hands. When he sat back down, he held it out to her. It was a knife, not large or particularly ornate, just a simple hunting knife in a leather sheath, well made and practical. "This is for you," he said. "Take it." Hetty stared at the knife, confused. "I do not understand." "You said you do not know how to make choices anymore," Tahir explained. "So here is your first one. You can take this knife or not. Either way is fine. But if you take it, it is yours, not mine. Not anyone else's, yours, to keep, to use, to decide what to do with. That is a choice. A small one, but still a choice. And tomorrow you will make another choice. And the day after that, another. And slowly, one choice at a time, you will remember what it feels like to own yourself again." Hetty looked at the knife, then at Tahir, then back at the knife. Her hand trembled as she reached out. For a moment she hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the leather sheath. Then slowly, deliberately, she wrapped her hand around it and pulled it toward her. The weight of it was solid, real. "Hers, thank you," she whispered, clutching the knife like it was something precious. Which, in a way, it was. It was more than just a weapon or a tool. It was a symbol, proof that someone believed she was capable of making decisions, of taking care of herself, of being something more than just a victim. Tahir nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "You are welcome. Now drink the rest of your tea and sleep. Tomorrow will be hard. You need rest." Hetty obeyed, finishing the sweet herb-laced water and setting the cup down carefully beside her. The exhaustion was overwhelming now, pulling at her like a physical weight. She lay down on the mat, the blanket wrapped around her, the knife clutched to her chest. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Tahir sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees, his eyes watchful and alert, standing guard, keeping her safe. And for the first time in 3 years, Henrietta Sutton closed her eyes and did not dream of cellars or chains or darkness. She dreamed of mountains and sky and the possibility of morning. Dawn came slowly to the mountain camp, filtering through the canopy of redwoods in thin golden shafts that painted the forest floor with light and shadow. Hetty woke to the smell of smoke and cooking meat, her body stiff and aching, but somehow more rested than it had been in years. For a moment she did not remember where she was, and panic clawed at her chest, that familiar terror of waking in the cellar with no light and no hope. Then she heard the crackle of fire and felt the wool blanket against her skin and remembered the forest, the Cahto hunter. Safety, at least for now. She sat up slowly, wincing as every muscle in her body protested the movement. The knife Tahir had given her was still clutched in her hand, and she looked at it for a long moment before carefully sliding it into the makeshift belt of her torn dress. Tahir was crouched by the fire, turning something on a spit, his movements economical and practiced. He glanced over when he heard her stir and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but did not speak. There was a quietness to the morning that felt sacred somehow, like the forest itself was still half asleep and conversation would be an intrusion. Hetty pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky but functional. She walked to the edge of the camp where she could see the valley spreading out below them, layer upon layer of green mountains fading into blue distance. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers and something else, something that smelled like freedom. She stood there, breathing it in, letting it fill her lungs, trying to remember the last time she had seen a sunrise without bars or walls or locked doors between her and the sky. "There is water beyond those trees," Tahir said from behind her, his voice low and respectful of the morning stillness. "A stream. Cold but clean. If you want to wash." Hetty turned to look at him, surprised by the consideration in his voice. He was not looking at her directly, but rather at the fire, giving her privacy even in conversation. She realized suddenly how filthy she must be. Days of dirt and blood and sweat caked onto her skin and hair. The thought of clean water, of washing away even a small part of what had happened, was almost painfully appealing. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I would like that." Tahir pointed through the trees. "Follow the deer trail about 50 paces. You will hear the water before you see it. I will keep watch from here. No one will disturb you." Hetty nodded and made her way carefully through the underbrush, following the narrow path he had indicated. True to his word, she heard the stream before she saw it, a musical rushing sound that grew louder as she approached. When she pushed through the last screen of ferns, she found herself standing beside a small waterfall that cascaded down a rocky cliff face into a crystal-clear pool below. The water was so transparent she could see smooth river stones on the bottom, and small fish darting between them like silver shadows. She looked around cautiously, making sure she was truly alone, then began the painful process of removing her ruined dress. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, stiff and swollen from her ordeal, and twice she had to stop and rest because her hands were shaking too badly to manage the fastenings. When she finally got the dress off, she stood for a moment in her thin chemise, looking down at her own body like it belonged to a stranger. She was covered in bruises, some fresh and purple, others fading to yellow and green. There were cuts on her arms and legs, scratches from brambles, rope burns on her wrists, a map of violence written on her skin. The water was shockingly cold when she stepped into it, so cold it stole her breath and made her gasp. But it was also clean and clear and honest, and she waded deeper despite the temperature, despite the way it made her teeth chatter and her skin pebble with goosebumps. When the water reached her waist, she ducked under completely, submerging her head and feeling the current pull at her tangled hair. She stayed under as long as she could, eyes closed, letting the cold numbness replace the constant ache of fear and exhaustion. When she finally surfaced, gasping for air, she felt something she had not felt in 3 years, present, real, alive. She scrubbed at her skin with her hands, trying to remove the layers of grime. Watching the water around her turn briefly cloudy before the current carried the dirt away downstream. She worked her fingers through her hair, pulling out tangles and debris, wincing when she found the tender spot on her scalp where Samuel had grabbed her that last night. The memory threatened to pull her under again, that suffocating darkness, but she pushed it away. She was not in that cellar anymore. She was here, in this mountain stream, under an open sky. She was here. By the time she climbed out of the water, her lips were blue and her whole body was shaking with cold, but she felt cleaner than she had in months. She wrung out her chemise as best she could and put her dress back on over it, though the fabric was so torn and stained it barely qualified as clothing anymore. When she made her way back to camp, Tahir had set out a plate of roasted meat and some kind of flatbread beside the fire. He handed her another cup of that sweet herbal tea without comment, and she accepted it gratefully, letting the warmth seep back into her frozen fingers. "You look better," Tahir observed quietly, though he still was not looking directly at her. She realized it was deliberate, this careful avoidance of direct eye contact, a way of giving her space, of not making her feel observed or judged. It was such a small thing, but it mattered enormously. "I feel better," Hetty admitted, sitting down and picking up the plate. The meat was rabbit perfectly cooked, and she ate ravenously, surprised by how hungry she was. The flatbread was dense and slightly sweet, made from some kind of ground acorn meal that tasted earthy and rich. Real food, not the moldy scraps Samuel had thrown down the cellar stairs when he remembered she needed to eat. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant calls of birds greeting the morning. Hetty found herself watching Tahir when he was not looking, studying this man who had saved her life for reasons she still did not fully understand. He moved with such certainty, such quiet confidence, like someone who had never questioned his right to exist in the world. She envied that, wondered what it would be like to move through life without constantly apologizing for taking up space. "What happens now?" she asked finally, setting down her empty plate. I cannot stay here forever, and I cannot go back. So what do I do? Tahir was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. That depends on what you want. If you want to disappear completely, I can take you north into Oregon Territory. There are settlements there where no one asks too many questions. You could start over with a new name, a new life, or I can take you west to the coast. There are ships that leave San Francisco every week for places all over the world. You would never have to see California again. Hetty felt something twist in her chest at the thought of running again, of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for Samuel's brothers to find her. And what if I do not want to run? What if I want them to pay for what they did? Tahir looked up at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Then we have a different conversation, a harder one. Before Hetty could respond, Tahir suddenly went very still, his head tilted slightly, listening to something she could not hear. Then in one fluid motion, he was on his feet, his rifle in his hands, his whole body tense and alert. He held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant, stay quiet and do not move. Hetty froze, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then Hetty heard it too, voices, men's voices, coming up the mountain from the south. Multiple people moving through the forest with the kind of careless noise that spoke of men who did not expect resistance. Samuel's brothers. They had found the trail. They were coming. Tahir's jaw tightened and he moved quickly, grabbing Hetty's arm and pulling her toward the shelter. He pushed aside the animal skin door and gestured inside. Get in, all the way to the back. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me? Hetty shook her head frantically. You cannot face them alone. There are too many. They will kill you. I am not going to face them, Tahir said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. I'm going to lead them away from here. Once they follow me, you run. Head north like I told you. Follow the river upstream until you reach the split pine. From there, turn west and keep walking. 3 days, and you will reach a trading post. Tell them Tahir Firehand sent you, and they will help you. No, Hetty said, her voice breaking. I am not leaving you to die for me. I'm not doing that again. I'm not. Tahir grabbed her shoulders, not roughly but firmly, making her look at him. Listen to me. This is not about dying. This is about living. You have a chance now. A real chance. Do not waste it because you feel guilty. Live. That is how you honor what I am doing. You live. The voices were closer now. Maybe 5 minutes away, maybe less. Tahir released her shoulders and gently pushed her toward the shelter entrance. Go, now, please. Hetty wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to do anything except hide, while someone else fought her battles. But she also knew he was right. She had no weapons except the small knife, no skills for this kind of fight. She would only be a liability, a distraction that could get them both killed. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She turned and crawled into the shelter, moving all the way to the back where the shadows were deepest. And she waited, through the gaps in the animal skin door. She watched Tahir move around the camp with swift efficiency. He scattered the fire, kicking dirt over the flames until only smoke remained. He grabbed several items from around the clearing, things she could not quite identify in her panic, and stuffed them into a pack. Then he picked up his rifle, checked it one last time, and melted into the forest, heading east away from the approaching voices, leaving an obvious trail for them to follow. Hetty held her breath, pressed against the back wall of the shelter, her knife gripped so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had gone white. The voices grew louder, closer. Then suddenly men were in the clearing, at least 4 of them, maybe 5. She recognized Samuel's brother Marcus immediately, his harsh voice cutting through the morning air like a saw. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. He was here. Look at this fire. Still warm? And there, boot prints. Indian by the look of them. Probably that savage who ran off our horses yesterday. Another voice, younger, uncertain. Maybe we should turn back, Marcus. This is getting too deep into their territory. If we run into a whole tribe—" "Shut up, Daniel," Marcus snapped. "We are not leaving without her. Samuel is dead because of that woman, and she is going to pay for it. Now spread out. Search everything. If she is here, I want her found." Hetty stopped breathing entirely as she heard footsteps approaching the shelter. Someone grabbed the animal skin door and yanked it aside, flooding the small space with light. A man ducked his head in, peering into the darkness. Hetty pressed herself flatter against the back wall, trying to become invisible, trying to simply stop existing. The man took one step inside, then another. His eyes had not adjusted to the dim interior yet, and he was squinting, searching. Then from somewhere in the forest came a sound, a whistle. High and piercing and distinctly not natural. The kind of sound designed to attract attention. The man at the shelter entrance turned sharply, listening. The whistle came again, from a different direction this time, and then Tahir's voice rang out through the trees, clear and mocking. "You are slow, white men. Too slow to catch wind. Too slow to catch shadows. Too slow to catch the woman you hunt. She's already gone. Far from here. But if you want revenge so badly, come and take it from me instead." Marcus roared in fury, a sound of pure rage, and Hetty heard the thunder of boots as all the men turned and crashed back into the forest, chasing after Tahir's voice. The man at the shelter entrance hesitated for just a moment, then turned and ran after his companions, leaving the clearing empty and silent, except for the distant sounds of pursuit fading into the mountains. Hetty waited, counted to 100 in her head, then counted again. The silence stretched on, broken only by the normal sounds of the forest, birds and wind and the distant rush of water. Slowly, carefully, she crawled out of the shelter and stood in the clearing, her legs shaking, her heart still pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Tahir was gone. The men were gone. She was alone. For a moment she stood there paralyzed, unsure what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to follow Tahir's instructions, to head north and save herself while she still could. But another part of her, a part that had been slowly growing stronger since yesterday, refused to run again, refused to let someone else pay the price for her freedom, refused to be the kind of person who saved herself by sacrificing others. She looked down at the knife in her hand. Such a small weapon, almost laughable against men with guns. But it was something. It was a choice. And Tahir had said that choices were how she would find herself again, one decision at a time. So she made a decision. She was not running north. She was going after them. Hetty moved quickly, gathering supplies from around the camp. She found a water skin and filled it from the barrel. She took some of the dried meat and flatbread and stuffed it into her pockets. She looked at Tahir's other supplies and found a small hatchet, its blade freshly sharpened, and she took that too. Not much of an arsenal, but better than nothing. Then she turned toward the forest, where the men had disappeared, and started walking. Following their trail was easy. They had crashed through the underbrush like a herd of elk, breaking branches and leaving bootprints in the soft earth. Hetty moved as quietly as she could, trying to remember how Tahir had walked yesterday, how he had placed his feet with such care and precision. She was not as skilled, not even close, but she tried. She had to be smart about this, had to think. Charging in blindly would only get her killed or captured, and neither of those outcomes helped Tahir. She tracked them for over an hour, moving steadily upward into rougher terrain. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but she could still see the trail, still follow the broken branches and disturbed earth. Her body ached with every step, but she pushed through it, fueled by something stronger than pain. Purpose. For 3 years she had been powerless, a victim with no agency, no choices, no control. But not anymore. Not today. Today she was going to save the man who had saved her, or she was going to die trying. Either way, it would be her choice. The trail led her to a narrow canyon, steep walls of rock rising on either side, the path between them barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. Hetty slowed down, her instincts screaming danger. This was the kind of place where people got trapped, where there was no escape if things went wrong. She crept forward cautiously, every sense alert, and that was when she heard the voices again. Closer now, much closer. She pressed herself against the canyon wall and edged forward until she could see around a bend in the rock. What she saw made her blood run cold. The men had cornered Tahir at the end of the canyon, where the walls pinched together, leaving no way out. He had his back to the stone, his rifle raised, facing 4 men who had their own weapons trained on him. It was a standoff, tense and deadly, nobody willing to make the first move, because the first move would likely mean dying. Marcus was talking, his voice venomous. "You made a mistake, Indian. Should have stayed out of white men's business. Now you are going to tell us where the woman went, and then you are going to die for helping her. Maybe we will make it quick. Maybe we will not. Depends on how cooperative you are." Tahir's voice was calm, almost amused. "I told you. She is gone. You will never find her now. And I am not going to die today. But you might—" Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are outnumbered 4-1, savage. You might get one of us before we put you down, but you are not walking out of this canyon alive. Accept it." Hetty's mind raced. She had to do something, had to act, but what? She was one person with a knife and a hatchet against 4 armed men. Direct confrontation was suicide. But maybe she did not need a direct confrontation. Maybe she just needed a distraction, something to tip the balance, give Tahir the advantage he needed. She looked up at the canyon walls rising on either side. They were steep but not quite vertical, studded with rocks and scraggly bushes that somehow managed to grow in the cracks. An idea formed in her mind, dangerous and probably foolish, but it was all she had. She moved carefully back down the canyon until she found a place where the wall was slightly less sheer, where there were enough handholds that she might possibly be able to climb. She looked at the rocks above, judging distances and angles, and then she started to climb. Every movement was agony. Her hands were still raw and tender, her body exhausted and battered. Twice she nearly fell, her fingers slipping on loose stone, her feet scrambling for purchase. But she kept going, driven by desperation and determination, pulling herself up one painful handhold at a time. When she finally reached a ledge about 30 feet above the canyon floor, she was breathing so hard she thought she might pass out. But she did not have time for weakness. She looked down and saw she was directly above where the men had Tahir trapped. Perfect. The ledge was littered with loose rocks, debris that had collected there over years of weathering and erosion. Hetty began gathering the largest ones she could lift, piling them at the edge of the outcropping. Her plan was simple, crude, but it might work. Below, she could hear Marcus still talking, his voice rising with impatience. "Last chance, Indian. Tell us where she went or I start shooting pieces off you until you change your mind." Hetty took a deep breath. This was it. No more time, no more chances. She grabbed the largest rock, lifted it over her head, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she hurled it over the edge. The rock fell 30 feet and struck the ground directly between Marcus and one of his men with a crack like a gunshot. Both men jumped, startled, spinning around to see what had happened. In that instant of distraction, Tahir moved. His rifle came up and fired, the sound deafening in the narrow confines of the canyon. One of the men went down with a scream, clutching his leg. Tahir was already moving, diving to the side, as return fire exploded from multiple directions, bullets sparking off stone where he had been standing a moment before. Hetty did not stop. She grabbed another rock and threw it, then another. They rained down on the men below, not doing much damage, but creating chaos, forcing them to look up, to divide their attention, to wonder what was happening. One rock caught a man on the shoulder and he staggered, cursing. Marcus was shouting orders, but his voice was lost in the confusion. Tahir used the distraction perfectly. He had dropped his empty rifle and drawn a long knife from his belt, and now he closed the distance with one of the men before the man could react. They went down together, struggling, and then Tahir was up again, and the other man was not. 2 down, 2 left. Better odds, but still not good. Hetty threw her last rock and then, without thinking, without planning, driven by pure instinct and adrenaline, she jumped. 30 feet, into open air, falling. She hit the ground hard, her legs buckling under her, pain shooting through her ankles and knees. But she rolled with the impact the way she had seen cats do. And somehow she came up on her feet with the hatchet in her hand. She was directly behind Marcus. He had not seen her fall, had not realized she was there. She had perhaps 2 seconds before he turned around. 2 seconds to act. Hetty raised the hatchet. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to bring it down, to bury it in the back of the man who represented everything she was running from. Every man who had ever hurt her or controlled her or made her feel like nothing. Her arm trembled with the need for violence, for revenge, for blood, but she did not strike. Instead she screamed, one word, as loud as she could, "Tahir!" Marcus spun around, his face registering shock, and then recognition, and then rage in rapid succession. He brought his rifle up, aiming directly at her chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Hetty saw everything with perfect clarity. The hatred in Marcus's eyes, the morning sun glinting off the rifle barrel, the small scar on his chin. She knew she was about to die, knew it with absolute certainty. But she also knew she had given Tahir the opening he needed, and that was enough. The rifle shot, when it came, was impossibly loud, and for a brief moment Hetty thought she had been hit. She waited for the pain, for the darkness, for the end, but it did not come. Instead, Marcus staggered forward, a look of confusion on his face, and then he fell. Behind him stood Tahir, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face grim. The last man dropped his weapon and raised his hands, his face pale with terror. "Do not shoot, please, I am done. I'm out." Tahir did not lower the pistol. "Run, run now, and do not stop. Tell anyone who asks that Henrietta Sutton is dead. She died in these mountains. Tell them you saw her body. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But if you ever come back here, if you ever speak her real name again, I will find you. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically and then turned and ran, scrambling back down the canyon, tripping and falling and picking himself up and running again until he disappeared around the bend. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Hetty stood there frozen, the hatchet still raised in her hand, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror and triumph. Tahir lowered his pistol and walked over to her slowly, carefully, like approaching a wild animal. "You came back," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before. "Wonder, maybe, or disbelief." "I could not leave you," Hetty whispered, her voice breaking. "I could not let you die for me. I could not." Her legs gave out and she collapsed. Tahir caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and steady, and he lowered her gently to sit against the canyon wall. He knelt beside her, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "That was the bravest and most foolish thing I have ever seen anyone do," Tahir said, and now there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. "You could have been killed. Should have been killed, but I was not," Hetty replied, and suddenly she was laughing. Great gasping laughs that bordered on hysterical because she was alive. She was actually alive. And for the first time in 3 years, she had chosen to fight instead of freeze, had chosen action instead of paralysis, had chosen herself. Tahir sat back on his heels, shaking his head in amazement. "No, you were not. Somehow you were not." They sat there in the canyon as the morning sun climbed higher, 2 people who had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the physical, and the mountains around them kept their secrets. They buried the bodies in shallow graves at the far end of the canyon, covering them with rocks and brush to keep the scavengers away for a while. It was grim work, made harder by the knowledge that these men had been hunting Hetty with the intention of killing her or worse. Tahir worked in silence, his movements efficient and practiced, while Hetty stood watch with his rifle, her hands steady despite the trembling in her legs. When the work was done, Tahir did not say any words over the graves. He simply turned and walked away, and Hetty followed. They made their way back to the mountain camp slowly, both of them exhausted and battered in different ways. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its long slide toward evening, and the forest was filled with the drowsy sounds of afternoon, insects humming and birds calling lazily from the branches above. Hetty found herself noticing things she had been too terrified to see before. The way light filtered through leaves in patterns like lace, the smell of wild honeysuckle growing along the trail, the feel of solid earth beneath her feet. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. When they reached the camp, Tahir immediately set about checking their supplies and erasing any signs of the morning's intrusion. He moved with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything, making sure the clearing looked as undisturbed as possible. Hetty watched him work for a while, then quietly began helping, gathering scattered items and reorganizing the shelter. They worked side by side without speaking, a comfortable rhythm developing between them, and Hetty realized this was what partnership felt like. Not ownership, not dominance, just two people working together toward a common goal. As the afternoon wore on, Tahir built up the fire again and set about preparing a meal. He pulled out supplies Hetty had not seen before, dried beans that he soaked in water, strips of venison that he began cutting into small pieces. Wild onions he must have gathered on one of his trips through the forest. He worked with the focused attention of someone who found peace in simple tasks, and Hetty found herself mesmerized by the way his hands moved, precise and sure, creating something nourishing from raw ingredients. "Can I help?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Tahir looked up, seeming to consider the question seriously. Then he nodded and gestured to a flat stone near the fire. "Grind these," he said, handing her a collection of seeds and a smaller stone to use as a pestle. "Not too fine. We want some texture." Hetty took the seeds and began grinding them, falling into the repetitive motion gratefully. It gave her hands something to do, her mind something to focus on, besides the events of the morning. The seeds released a nutty, almost buttery smell as she worked them, and she found herself wondering what they were, what they would add to the meal. What other knowledge Tahir carried in his head about living in these mountains? What happens now? She asked after a while, echoing the question she had asked that morning, though it felt like a lifetime ago. "The man who ran, he will tell people. Even if he says I am dead, someone might come looking. Someone might not believe him." Tahir stirred the pot he had hung over the fire, his expression thoughtful. "He will tell them you are dead because he is afraid not to. Fear is a powerful motivator, but you are right that staying here is not safe anymore. This place is compromised. Tomorrow we will need to move." "Move where?" Hetty asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Every option seemed impossible in its own way. "North," Tahir said firmly, "into deeper territory where white men rarely go. There is a place about 4 days from here where my people have a winter camp. It will be mostly empty this time of year, but there will be a few elders there keeping watch. You can stay with them. They will protect you." Hetty felt something twist in her chest. "And then what? I just live there forever? Hide in the mountains and hope no one ever comes looking? That is not a life, Tahir. That is just a different kind of prison." Tahir was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but honest. "You are right. It is not ideal, but it is safe. And right now, safety is what you need most. Later, when enough time has passed, when people have forgotten and moved on to other troubles, then maybe you can think about what kind of life you want to build. But that time is not now." Hetty ground the seeds harder, frustration and gratitude, and a dozen other emotions warring in her chest. She knew he was right, knew that survival had to come before freedom, at least for now. But the thought of hiding again, even in a place that was not a cellar, even with people who might be kind, made her want to scream. She had just started to feel like a person again, just started to remember what it meant to make choices and take action. And now she was supposed to disappear again, become invisible again, wait patiently for permission to exist. "What if I do not want to hide?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "What if I want to actually live? Not just survive, but live?" have a home that is mine, a name that is mine, a future that belongs to me and not to anyone else? Tahir set down the spoon he had been using to stir and turned to face her fully. His expression was serious, searching. Then you will have to fight for it. And I do not mean the way you fought this morning. I mean every day, every moment, fighting to remember who you are when the world tries to tell you that you are nothing. Fighting to take up space when everyone wants you to disappear. Fighting to believe you deserve good things when 3 years of darkness taught you otherwise. That kind of fighting is harder than any physical battle. It does not end. There is no final victory. Just the choice to keep fighting day after day until one day you realize you are not fighting anymore. You are just living. His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Because they were true, every syllable. And because she realized in that moment that he was not just talking about her, he was talking about himself too. About Ayana, about every person who had ever survived something that should have destroyed them, and then had to figure out how to exist in the aftermath. How do you do it? Hetty asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How do you keep going when you have lost so much? Tahir looked away, staring into the forest as if the answer might be written in the trees. I remember her laugh, he said finally. My sister. I remember the way she used to sing while she worked, making up silly songs about whatever task she was doing. Grinding corn, mending clothes, gathering firewood. Everything had a song, and I think about how angry she would be if I let her death mean nothing. If I let it break me so completely that I stopped seeing beauty in the world. So I look for the beauty. I find it in small things. The way light hits water, the track of an animal in fresh snow, the taste of wild strawberries in summer. I collect these moments like they are treasures. And some days that is enough. Hetty felt tears sliding down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. She wiped at them with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of seed dust across her face. I do not know if I can do that. I do not know if I'm strong enough. You jumped off a cliff this morning to save my life, Tahir said, and now there was warmth in his voice, something almost like affection. You climbed a canyon wall with torn hands and threw rocks at armed men. You made a choice to stand and fight instead of running away. If that is not strength, I do not know what is. That was different, Hetty protested. That was just reaction, adrenaline, fear. No, Tahir said firmly. That was courage. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite the fear, choosing to do the right thing even when you are terrified. You have that in you, Henrietta Sutton. I saw it today. You just need to learn to see it in yourself. The sun was beginning to set now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple. The air was cooling rapidly, and Hetty pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Tahir served them both bowls of the stew he had been preparing, and they ate in companionable silence, watching the light fade from the world. The food was hearty and warming, filling Hetty's belly and easing some of the constant ache of exhaustion that had become her baseline. After they finished eating, Tahir produced a small leather bag from his supplies and opened it to reveal dried tobacco and thin papers. He began rolling a cigarette with practiced movements, his hands steady and sure. Hetty watched, fascinated despite herself. She had seen men smoke before, of course, but always as an act of dominance, of taking up space and air and demanding attention. When Tahir did it, it seemed more like meditation, a quiet ritual that had nothing to do with anyone but himself. He lit the cigarette with a twig from the fire and took a long drag, then exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting up into the darkening sky. He sat like that for a while, smoking and thinking, and Hetty did not interrupt. She was learning that silence with Tahir was not uncomfortable. It was not demand or punishment. It was just space, room to think and feel and exist without explanation. I have been thinking about what you said, Tahir began finally, his voice quiet. About not wanting to hide. About wanting to actually live. And I think maybe there is another option. When I did not consider before, Hetty looked up, surprised. What option? Stay here, Tahir said simply. Not in this exact camp, but in these mountains. Learn to live the way I live. Learn to hunt and track and read the forest. Learn to move through the world without leaving traces. Learn to be part of the wilderness instead of separate from it. It would not be easy. It would require you to give up everything you knew before. Your old name, your old life, your old ideas about what a woman should be or do. But you would be free, truly free. And you would be alive. Hetty stared at him, her mind racing. The idea was absurd, impossible. She was a city girl, raised in Boston drawing rooms and taught to embroider and pour tea. What did she know about surviving in the wilderness? What could she possibly offer to a life like that, except liability and weakness? But even as she thought these things, another part of her was already imagining it. Waking up to sunrises over mountains, learning to read animal tracks and weather patterns, building a life with her own hands instead of being given one by men who thought they owned her. "You would teach me?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Even though I know nothing? Even though I would slow you down and probably get in the way?" "Everyone starts knowing nothing," Tahir replied with a small smile. "I was not born understanding these mountains. I learned, just as you can learn. It will take time, patience, many mistakes. But if you truly want freedom, this is what it looks like. Not a house in a town where neighbors watch and judge. Not a new name in a new place where you are always afraid someone will discover who you really are. But this, the forest, the mountains, a life where the only person you answer to is yourself." Hetty felt something unfurling in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been terror, or might have been both at once. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, stepping off a train in Sacramento with her few belongings and her father's promises ringing in her ears. That woman would never have considered living in the wilderness. That woman would have been horrified at the very suggestion. But that woman was gone, had died in a cellar somewhere between the first beating and the last. And the person sitting here now, scarred and exhausted, and still somehow breathing, this person was different. This person had jumped off a cliff, had thrown rocks at armed men, had chosen to stand and fight instead of run and hide. "Yes," Hetty said, and the word came out stronger than she expected, more certain. "Yes, I want to learn. I want to try. I want to live like that." Tahir nodded slowly, his expression serious but approving. "Then tomorrow we start. I will teach you to move quietly through the forest, to find water and identify which plants are food and which are poison, to read the sky and know when weather is coming, to build shelter and make fire and track game. It will be hard. Some days you will want to quit. But if you commit to this, if you truly dedicate yourself to learning, then one day you will wake up and realize you are not afraid anymore. You will realize you belong here. And that feeling is worth more than any comfort civilization could ever offer." They talked long into the night, making plans, discussing what Hetty would need to learn, and in what order. Tahir told her stories about the Cahto people, their customs and beliefs, the way they saw the world not as something to be conquered, but as something to be lived with, part of rather than separate from. He told her about the cycles of seasons in these mountains, how winter could be brutal but also beautiful, how spring came late, but when it arrived, it transformed everything overnight. He told her about the animals that lived here, not just as prey or danger, but as neighbors, each with their own intelligence and purpose, and Hetty listened to every word, soaking it in like someone dying of thirst, finally finding water. She asked questions, dozens of them, and Tahir answered each one with patience and detail. He did not laugh at her ignorance or make her feel foolish for not knowing things that seemed obvious to him. He simply explained, demonstrated when possible, encouraged her to observe and learn and trust her instincts. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they settled in for the night. Tahir took first watch, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his knees, while Hetty curled up in the shelter with her blanket and her new knife. But unlike the night before, sleep did not come immediately. Her mind was too full, spinning with possibilities and fears and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of hope. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the crackling fire and the sounds of the forest and Tahir's quiet breathing. And she thought about futures, not the future she had been promised as a girl, marriage and children and a proper household. Not the future she had lived in the cellar, endless darkness and pain and the slow erosion of self, but a different future entirely, one she was going to build with her own hands. One where she woke each morning and decided what her day would hold. One where she was not property or prisoner or victim, but simply herself, whatever that turned out to mean. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke to Tahir gently shaking her shoulder, the sky already lightening with the first hints of dawn. He handed her a cup of water and some dried fruit, and while she ate, he began breaking down the camp with swift efficiency. Everything was packed and ready to move within an hour, and then they were walking again, heading deeper into the mountains, away from everything Hetty had ever known. They traveled for 3 days, moving steadily north and west, climbing higher into elevations where the air grew thin and cold even in summer. Tahir set a pace Hetty could barely maintain, but when she started to flag, he would stop and rest without making her ask, offering water and food and quiet encouragement. He began teaching her as they walked, pointing out signs she would have missed, animal tracks and broken branches and subtle changes in vegetation that indicated water nearby. He showed her which berries were safe to eat and which would make her sick. He taught her to walk more quietly, to place her feet more carefully, to move through the forest like she belonged there, instead of crashing through it like an invader. Each night they made camp, and Tahir continued her education, teaching her to build a fire without matches, to set simple snares for small game, to read the stars for navigation. Hetty absorbed everything like a sponge, her mind sharp and hungry, after 3 years of having nothing to think about except survival. She made mistakes constantly, burned her fingers on hot coals, and got scratched by thorns, and lost her footing on steep trails. But she also learned, quickly, more quickly than Tahir had expected. He told her one evening, a note of surprised approval in his voice. On the 4th day, they reached the winter camp Tahir had mentioned. It was more substantial than his mountain shelter, several well-built structures made from logs and bark, arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. As Tahir had predicted, it was mostly empty, but there were 3 elders there, 2 women and 1 man, all with faces like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. They watched Hetty approach with obvious suspicion and curiosity, but when Tahir spoke to them in their own language, explaining who she was and what had happened, their expressions softened. The oldest woman, who Tahir introduced as Grandmother Willow, came forward and took Hetty's hands in her own, examining the healing cuts and calluses with knowing eyes. She said something in Cahto that Hetty did not understand, and Tahir translated. She says you have the hands of someone who has known suffering, but who is learning to fight back. She says this is good. She says you are welcome here. Tears pricked at Hetty's eyes at the simple kindness in those words. Welcome. When was the last time anyone had made her feel welcome anywhere? She managed a shaky smile and thanked Grandmother Willow as best she could, wishing desperately that she spoke the language, that she could communicate the depth of her gratitude. The old woman seemed to understand anyway, patting her cheek gently before returning to her work. Tahir stayed at the camp for 2 more days, helping Hetty settle in and continuing her lessons. The elders watched with interest, occasionally offering their own advice or corrections, and Hetty found herself starting to understand the rhythms of this life, the way everything was connected to everything else, the importance of respect and reciprocity and living in balance with the world around you. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tahir came to her as she was practicing the knots he had been teaching her, his expression somber. I need to go, he said without preamble. There are things I must attend to, obligations, but I will come back. In 1 month, when the moon is full again, I will return to check on you, to see how you are doing, to continue teaching if you still want to learn. Hetty felt panic flutter in her chest, that old familiar terror of being left alone. But she forced it down, recognizing it for what it was, a learned response, not a real threat. She was not alone. She was with people who had agreed to help her. She had skills now, small and fragile, but growing. She had choices. She had herself. "I will be here," she said, standing up and meeting his eyes. "And I will be better at this than I am now. I promise." Tahir smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face into something warmer, younger. "I do not doubt it. You are stronger than you know, Henrietta Sutton. Remember that when things get hard. Remember that you survived. And remember that surviving was only the beginning." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her one more time. "What will you call yourself?" he asked. "Here in this new life? Henrietta Sutton is dead, remember? The man who ran is telling everyone so. You can be anyone now. Who do you want to be?" Hetty thought about it, really thought about it. All the names she had carried in her life. Henrietta, the proper Boston daughter, Mrs. Pritchard, the rancher's wife, the nameless thing in the cellar. None of them fit anymore. None of them belonged to the person she was becoming. She looked around at the mountains rising in every direction, at the endless green of the forest, at the sky so blue it hurt to look at. She thought about jumping off that cliff, about throwing rocks at armed men, about choosing to learn instead of hide, about all the versions of herself she might still become. "Hetty," she said finally. "Just Hetty. Not Henrietta, not Sutton, not anyone's property or anyone's shame. Just Hetty. That is who I want to be." Tahir nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then that is who you are. Welcome to the mountains, Hetty. Welcome to your life." He left then, walking into the forest with that same fluid grace, and within moments he had disappeared completely, as if he had never been there at all. Hetty stood watching the place where he had vanished for a long time, and then she turned back to the camp, back to Grandmother Willow and the other elders, back to her knots and her lessons and her slowly callousing hands. Years later, people in the valleys below would sometimes tell stories about a white woman who lived with the Cahto people high in the mountains. They said she could track game better than most men, that she moved through the forest like smoke, that she had once killed 3 men in a canyon using nothing but rocks and a hatchet. Some said she had been a captive who escaped. Others said she had been running from the law. A few claimed she was a witch or a ghost or some kind of spirit that protected the mountains from those who would harm them. But Hetty, sitting by her fire on cold winter nights or walking through summer meadows thick with wildflowers, did not care what stories people told. She had her own story now, one she was writing with every choice, every sunrise, every moment she chose to keep going. And that story, the true one that no one else would ever fully know, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The deer moved through the clearing like liquid shadow, its head down as it grazed on tender shoots, pushing through melting snow. Hetty watched from 15 yards away, her bow drawn, arrow nocked. She had tracked this buck for 3 hours. Now she had a clear shot, but she did not release. Instead, she watched the deer eat, admiring its grace, the alertness in its eyes. It was magnificent. Taking it would mean meat for weeks. But today, Hetty decided it could live. She lowered her bow slowly. The deer continued grazing, unaware. Hetty backed away carefully, then turned toward camp, her moccasins silent on the forest floor. 5 years ago she could not walk 10 feet without snapping branches. Now she moved through wilderness like she had been born to it. The camp had grown since that first autumn. 7 lodges now housed 30 people. Hetty had found her place among them, earning respect through hard work. She emerged from the tree line to find Grandmother Willow tending the central fire. The old woman raised an eyebrow at Hetty's empty hands. "The buck was too beautiful," Hetty said in careful Cahto. "I will try tomorrow." "Beauty is not a reason to starve," Grandmother Willow replied warmly. "Though we have enough stored. Besides, Tahir brought supplies yesterday, including real salt." Hetty's head snapped up. "Tahir is here?" "Arrived late last night." "He is with the council elders." Grandmother Willow studied her. "He brought his winter pack. Usually means at least a week. You should tell him what? What your heart has been saying for 2 years. Life is short. Speak or stop pretending you do not care." Heat rose to Hetty's cheeks. "He saved my life. How can I burden him with unwanted feelings?" Grandmother Willow waved her spoon dismissively. "He looks at you the way a man looks at home. Anyone can see it except you. Now go wash before he sees you." An hour later, Hetty found Tahir at the edge of camp, checking strings on a new bow. He looked up and smiled, transforming his serious face. "I heard you let a deer go," he said. "Grandmother Willow thinks you're getting soft. I think I am getting selective." "That buck deserved another season." Hetty sat beside him. "She said you might stay a while. A week, maybe longer. The valleys are complicated. More settlers every month. The elders asked me to scout western boundaries." He set down the bow. "I also wanted to see you. It has been nearly a month, 26 days, Hetty said before she could stop herself. His expression softened. "You counted?" "I count lots of things. The moon cycles, snow patterns. It helps with planning." "Hetty," Tahir said her name softly, "may I tell you something I have thought about for a long time?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He moved closer, their shoulders almost touching. "When I found you 5 years ago, I thought I was saving you because of Ayana. Because I failed my sister, and helping you might make up for that failure. Perhaps that was true at first. But somewhere along the way, something changed. You stopped being someone I rescued and became someone I admired, someone whose strength inspired me. You learned in 5 years what takes most a lifetime. You became part of these mountains. You earned respect and trust. You became Hetty. Just Hetty, and that person is someone I love. Not because I saved you or feel responsible, but because of who you are, who you chose to become. I love your stubbornness when learning. I love that you talk to animals when you think no one listens. I love that you let that buck live because beauty mattered more than hunger. I love that you counted the days. I love you. I have for a long time. But I did not want to say anything because you had already been owned by one man, treated like property. I never wanted you to feel I expected anything because of what I did. Your freedom was hard-won. I would never take it away." Hetty sat stunned. Tahir loved her, actually loved her. Not from obligation, but because of who she was. "Say something," Tahir said, anxiety in his voice. "Please?" "I was afraid," Hetty said, words tumbling out. "Afraid what I felt was just gratitude, that I was too broken to know the difference. So I tried ignoring it, but it got stronger. Every time you left, I counted days until you returned. Every time you taught me something, I wanted to learn more, not for knowledge, but to spend time with you. Every time you smiled, I felt like I could conquer the world. What I feel has nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the fact that you see me. Really see me, not as victim or project, but as a person, as Hetty. So yes, Tahir, I love you too. I have for longer than I wanted to admit." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise over mountains. He reached out and took her hand, thumb brushing her calloused knuckles. "What happens now?" Hetty asked. "Now we figure it out together. No obligations. Just two people who love each other trying to build something good. This is your choice, Hetty. Always your choice. I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." They sat talking about futures as the sun climbed higher. Tahir told her about a hidden valley he had found, a place with good water where they could build a home, somewhere between his camps and the winter settlement, a place that would be theirs. Hetty told him about her dream of learning leatherworking, making useful things to trade with other communities. They talked about seasons and hunting and whether they wanted children someday. That conversation was tentative because Hetty was not sure she could be a mother after everything she had endured. Tahir assured her that wanting children was not required for loving someone, that a full life could take many forms. As afternoon wore on, others emerged from lodges. Several noticed Hetty and Tahir sitting close, hands joined, and knowing smiles passed between elders. Grandmother Willow walked by carrying firewood and made a satisfied huffing sound that clearly said, "It is about time." Two young children ran past, chasing each other with sticks, their laughter bright and carefree. Hetty watched them with wonder and sadness, thinking about the child she had once been. That evening, the camp gathered around the fire for a communal meal. It was tradition when Tahir visited. The food was simple but plentiful, roasted roots and steamed greens, and the last stored salmon, everything seasoned with the salt Tahir had brought. People talked and laughed. Children ran between lodges playing games. The fire sent sparks into a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. Tahir stood and addressed the community in formal Cahto. Hetty understood most of it now. He thanked them for their hospitality and acceptance. He spoke of changes in the valleys below and the importance of protecting the high country. Then he announced that he had asked Hetty to build a life with him, and she had accepted, requesting their blessing. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People called out approval. Women ululated, that distinctive cry of joy. Grandmother Willow stood and delivered a lengthy speech about stubborn young people who took too long to figure out what everyone already knew, which made the crowd laugh. Then she raised a cup in toast and everyone joined her, drinking deeply and refilling their cups. Later, when the fire had burned to glowing coals, Hetty and Tahir walked to the edge of camp, where they could look over the valley. The moon was nearly full, painting everything silver. Somewhere a wolf howled, answered by another from a different direction. "Are you happy?" Tahir asked, his arm around her shoulders. Hetty thought seriously before answering. 5 years ago, she would not have known how to recognize happiness. She had been so deep in darkness that any emotion besides fear had seemed impossible. But now, under stars that felt like old friends, surrounded by people who accepted her, loved by a man who saw her as equal, she could honestly say, "Yes, I am happy. Not perfectly happy without shadows or doubts, but real happiness. The kind that exists alongside other things. The kind that gets stronger because you fought for it instead of being given it. I'm happy, Tahir. For the first time in my entire life, I am genuinely, truly happy too. Good. That is all I ever wanted for you. Happiness, freedom, a life worth living." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the moon track across the sky. Hetty thought about the woman she had been, begging a stranger to keep walking and leave her to die. She thought about how Tahir had misunderstood, had heard her desperate plea as something different, had chosen to carry her to safety. That misunderstanding had saved her life, had given her a second chance, had led her to this moment, this place, this person beside her. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For not walking past me that day, for teaching me to survive, for giving me space to become someone new, for loving me even when I was too afraid to love myself. You do not need to thank me. You did the hard work. You made the choices. You became who you are. I just walked beside you while you figured it out. Still, thank you for walking beside me, for staying, for being exactly who you are." As they turned back toward camp, Tahir caught her hand once more. "Sleep well, Hetty. Dream of good things." "I will. I always do now." And it was true. The nightmares that had plagued her for years had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of mountains and sky and endless possibility. Dreams where she could run without being chased, speak without being silenced, exist without fear. Dreams that were not so different from her waking life anymore. Years later, people in the valleys told stories about the white woman who lived with the Cahto people. They said she married a great hunter, that they built a home in a hidden valley and lived in peace. They said she became known for leatherworking, that people traveled days to commission her craftsmanship. They said when the couple appeared in settlements, it was clear they had found something rare, a partnership built on respect and equality and genuine affection. But the truest stories were never told in the valleys. They were carried in mountain people's memories, passed down through generations as lessons about resilience and transformation and the power of choosing who you want to become. They were told around fires on winter nights, about the woman who arrived broken and afraid and became someone strong enough to jump off cliffs and gentle enough to spare deer. About the hunter who understood that saving someone's life meant giving them space to save themselves. About two people who found each other in darkness and chose to walk toward light. Hetty herself, growing older in her mountain home. teaching young people to hunt and live with the land. Would sometimes think back to that moment when she begged Tahir to keep going, to leave her behind. She would think about how the best things in her life had come from a misunderstanding, from words interpreted differently than she meant them. She would think about how often we do not know what we truly need until someone gives it to us anyway. She never regretted that day, never wished it had gone differently, because that misunderstanding had given her everything, had given her life, had given her herself, and that was worth every moment of fear and pain and struggle that had come before and after. Some stories end with happily ever after. This one ended with something better. It ended with simply living, fully, freely, authentically, without apology or permission or looking over her shoulder. Hetty lived the life she built with her own hands, loved the man she chose with her whole heart, and died decades later as an old woman surrounded by people who honored her memory. But that is another story. This one ends here in the moonlight, with two people choosing each other and a future spreading before them like an unwritten book. This one ends with the beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.